Hey guys, I have a question for you. How do you spread abundance? This year, Joe and I are spreading even more abundance by giving out insights on money, wealth strategies, and resources in our current newsletter, Creating Abundance in 52 Weeks, that we want to share with you for free. So sign up right now as you're listening to this episode on our website at www.abundantculture.co. That's .co/newsletter. www.abundantculture.co/newsletter. Don't let delay get in the way of your abundant year. Now, back to the episode. Welcome back to Abundant Culture Podcast,
where we dissect the mindsets and tactics of the true beasts of business.
People like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, and Warren Buffett.
All to create a blueprint to experience life more abundantly.
Hey everybody, it's Joe here. Welcome back to the Abundant Culture Podcast. We're so glad to have you back again this week because we're talking about something that is extremely crucial for every company on the face of the planet. But let me start off by asking you a question. Have you ever wondered what was the difference between companies that thrived and companies that eventually went out of business? Between the companies that innovate and the ones that don't? And why some companies have interns that are willing to do anything just to get in the door while others struggle to find talent while paying top dollar? You're going to learn the answers to all of those questions and many more from a person who has a PhD in social science from Oxford University, which he now uses to coach leaders in top organizations such as American Express, Disney, Microsoft, and many, many more big name brands. And now he's going to bring all of that expertise to you. We're going to be talking about psychological safety and the importance of it and how you can use it in order to thrive your company. So feel free to get ready to learn from and listen to our good friend, Timothy R. Clark.
So hi, Tim, and thank you again for coming onto the Abundant Culture Podcast. We are so happy to have you today because I was talking to one of your associates on LinkedIn, and they were telling me about the new book that you have coming out, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. So we have to have him on the podcast. So before we get into all the psychology things, can you tell us, how did you get into business? Like, what's that backstory?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. The backstory is it was accidental, which is probably true for a lot of entrepreneurs, I would guess. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
So many entrepreneurs, they didn't set out to be entrepreneurs. They didn't make a plan and say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And I don't think that probably happens sometimes, but I would guess that maybe most of the time that doesn't happen.
For sure.
So really, for me, I guess the way that it happened was I worked for a company, and that company was sold, and I was actually the president of the company, and it was a consulting company. So we were owned by a Japanese parent company. Mm-hmm. And after 4 years, they decided to sell the company, and my job was going to be eliminated because the new owners were going to take care of the leadership role. And so I found myself basically without a job. And so the question was, do I go find another job with an organization, or do I strike out on my own?
Yeah.
So that probably happens to a lot of people. Yeah. And so my wife, Tracy, and I, we talked it through, and we said, you know what, let's go hang a shingle and let's give it a try. That's what happened. So it wasn't part of any master plan, I could tell you that. But sure. I think that's what makes entrepreneurship kind of exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, can you take us kind of through the journey of having to leave this company because, the new owners are going to really take over that role in that position, to getting into what you do now? Like, how did you bridge that gap between where you are today and that, fateful day where it was like basically the last day at your company? And how did that feel for you as well?
Well, it was scary. It was frightening. And I think we all those of us who are in entrepreneurship, we have to admit that it's a gigantic risk. You're putting everything on the line. You don't know how it's going to turn out, but that's the very nature of entrepreneurship. So my story goes back even further because I trained originally. My career path was to be a professor. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach. I wanted to have a kind of a comfortable, stable life teaching at some college, right? And I could visualize myself doing that. And I would have this little house and a picket fence, and I would go to the college every day, and I would wear my tweed, and I'd learn how to use chalk, and I would teach students, and I'd kind of nestle into this cozy academic life.
Yeah.
That was my vision. And it didn't turn out that way because, so I did my PhD in England at Oxford University. And before I finished completely, we had to come back because we were out of money. The ramen budget was gone. And so it was time to get a job. So I had to get a full-time job and finish my research at the same time. Well, that's what initially took me into business. And I never recovered and got back into academia. Does that make sense? So I was gone and I was never to be reclaimed again. So that was that fateful kind of turn into the business world. And I found that I enjoyed business. I enjoyed managing and leading people. And so then I went into kind of the consulting area, and then that organization was sold, and I said, okay, I'm going to try to do this myself. And then the other thing I think that's important to understand is that I felt that I could use my research background because I'm trained as a social scientist, and I felt that there were important things that I could help teach to people that were running organizations and businesses that they could use that would be very helpful to them. And so that's when I started writing my first book. And that's kind of a long story short.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were a consultant when you were at the company, or a vice president of a consultant company, if I'm not mistaken. How does what was your job description there? What did you do? What did an average day in the life really look like for you back then?
So I was the president of the company, so I just managed everybody.
Oh wow.
So I managed the consulting team. I managed all of the other support functions, human resources and accounting and production and fulfillment and all of that stuff. Yeah. And, but it's interesting because that was kind of boring compared to working with clients and getting on the ground with them and trying to help them solve very difficult problems. So I think that's another reason it motivated me to start my own shop and build this boutique firm that we now have, because we work on very interesting projects with lots of different organizations. So I'm never bored.
Yeah.
I can tell you that I'm never bored.
Absolutely. And can you give us some insight on what type of consulting you did versus the type of consulting that you do now? Are they very, very similar or very
pretty
different?
Similar. So
okay.
we consult in the areas of we call it organizational transformation. How do you take an organization and strategically and culturally shift its direction? Wow. Because it's struggling, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what I talk about in this new book. So how do you do that? And what is it that gets in the way? And that's where the 4 stages of psychological safety comes in. And we can talk about that at some point.
Oh, yeah. We're definitely going to get into that for sure.
So before we get into the psychological safety part, what are some major things that you learned working with the past companies that you've led?
I think one of the things that comes first to mind, Jasmine, is that you have to learn in this business that I'm in, you have to learn total accountability.
Yeah.
Now, here's something that I observed earlier in my career when I worked in large organizations. Sometimes people, they didn't have that attitude. They'd say, I do a piece of this process or project, and then I give it to somebody else. Or I can even hide a little bit in the bowels of this organization, because you can often do that in a large organization.
Yep.
But in our business, you can't do that.
Right.
Every client is your boss. And usually you only get one opportunity to shine, one opportunity to deliver on the results that they're expecting. And so you learn from day one, you learn accountability in a very deep sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I think that's helpful because you eliminate from your thinking the possibility of taking a shortcut, or you eliminate the idea that there's an easy answer. You don't even think in those terms, or that you can hide something. You don't think in those terms.
Yeah.
At all. And that becomes, I think, a great blessing, because you learn the standard of very high, consistent performance, and that becomes the culture of the organization. So that would be one thing, Jasmine, that I've learned that is very important, because your clients need to be able to trust you.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? That means that they can predict your behavior and your performance. They know what they're going to get, and it's got to be consistent and it's got to be outstanding. So that working with clients and customers directly is a tutoring experience. It tutors you, and you realize there are no shortcuts.
No.
You get that completely out of your mind. It's not even a possibility.
Yeah, for sure. And in your opinion, one thing I always really wonder, especially as a new entrepreneur myself, do you believe that the processes of a company is more important, or is the culture of that company more important, or are they have equal importance in the success and the growth of that company?
Well, to answer that question, Joe, here's what I would say. So early in my career, I was a plant manager in manufacturing. So I managed a big plant.
Yeah.
And when I first got that job, I did a series of meetings in different parts of the plant. So we had one department and then another, and I went through all these departments. And in every department, some people would pull me aside and they say, Tim, you know what? You need to understand that our department is different than all the others, and it's unique. And without us, none of this would happen. So here's what's interesting. Every single department told me that. Right?
That is interesting.
So why did they tell me that? Well, they want to be a little more special than the next guy. I get that. But if the entire system relies on all of those pieces. So if you ask culture versus systems, that's a false dichotomy. You have to have both. Now, what comes first in an organization? If you're an entrepreneur and you're building an organization, then the culture starts to come into shape first, because a culture is based on a set of norms. Norms are patterns of behavior. So that's going to start forming on day one.
Yeah.
By definition, a startup company is what we call process immature. The processes are very immature.
Yeah.
In fact, many times they're not defined, and the people in a startup, the entrepreneurs, they're doing everything.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they go through stages of development, and little by little, those processes become more defined and they become more mature. That's the normal process of growing up as an organization. So you're going to need culture and you're going to need process. Now, your process becomes very important as you grow because you can't scale unless you have good processes that allow you to scale.
So true.
Right?
Yeah.
But also, your culture will be what enables you to be successful, or it will be what gets in the way of your being successful. So culture cuts both ways.
Yeah.
It can be an asset and it can be a liability. But you're going to start forming that on day one. Sure. I don't know if that's helpful, but
that is
have
very
to have both.
Yeah. And another thing that, because we love to just talk about company culture here on the Abundant Culture podcast, because we feel like it's the most one of the most underrated things in business. I feel like people are more familiar with the strategy, the process, the systems and stuff like that, and all that makes sense. Yeah. But I feel like culture a lot of times gets put on the back burner because it's seen as this very intangible thing. So with that being said, what would you actually consider to be the things that actually make up a culture, and what is for our viewers who are probably kind of newer, what exactly is a company culture and what makes that up?
Sure. So, and I talk quite a bit about this in the book. So if you look at the anatomy of culture, culture exists. If you take a big organization, it exists on at least 3 levels. First, you have the macro culture, which is the entire organization. Then you have subcultures by department or by functional area or by geographic location.
Yeah.
That's the second level. The third level is what we call a microculture, and that normally exists at a team level. So your team is your basic unit of performance. It's also your basic unit of culture. Every team has a different culture, right?
Yeah.
So here's what we know about culture. We call this the culture formation hypothesis. The single most important factor in the formation of culture is the modeling behavior of the leader.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's as close to Newtonian physics as we can get when it comes to culture. It's always true.
Yeah.
It's always true. The culture reflects the leader more than anything else. So the leader is either leading the way with culture or getting in the way. Those are your only 2 choices. You either lead the way or get in the way. You can't be neutral as a leader. You are always modeling. The only question is, what are you going to model?
Yeah.
So you're going to lead the way or you're going to get in the way?
Yeah.
Because the team and the organizations don't outperform their leaders. They reflect them.
Wow.
Right? So to your point, Joe, you are spot on. Culture is profoundly important in an organization. Now, so here's what we explore in this book, which I think is very important. In the 21st century, if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to be competing, chances are, in a very competitive environment.
Yep.
Right?
Yes.
And so you're going to need a culture that is agile and responsive and aggressive. And so the culture the type of culture that I've been studying and that I think is most effective in the 21st century is what I call a culture of intellectual bravery. Now, let me explain what that means. That means that it's not expensive emotionally or socially or politically for me to engage. So I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to weigh in. I'm going to give you the benefit of my best thinking, because how do entrepreneurs succeed? They succeed by figuring out solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They succeed by solving problems. they succeed by innovating. Well, what kind of culture can give you those things? It's only a culture of intellectual bravery. If you have people that give you groupthink, if you have people that create an echo chamber, that are not engaging, they're not weighing in, you're never going to get there. You need your people's best thinking. And so what does that mean? That means when they're vulnerable and they weigh in, or they want to, you're going to reward that vulnerability. You're not going to punish it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So here, let me give you an example. So I've been studying these organizational culture for the last 25 years. And if you look at organizations that die, right, they didn't make it, but they were once successful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then they died. Why did they die?
Yeah.
Why did they die? After they were successful for many years and then they died. Here's my hypothesis. Most of those organizations died because they lost their culture of intellectual bravery. They lost their ability. Here's an organization filled with highly intelligent, talented people. They lost their ability to look at the competitive environment and respond to it. They lost their adaptive capacity. And whose fault is that? Leadership.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Because people, they didn't feel psychologically safe. And so when you don't feel psychologically safe, what do? You retrench, you protect yourself, and you're not going to engage. Entrepreneurs have to have that.
Yeah.
They cannot be successful if one person's doing the thinking. It's not going to work. It has to be a collaborative process. So the leader or leaders have to be personally secure enough to invite people to challenge them, to give people a license to disagree, and insist that they use it. That's the kind of culture we need. That's what intellectual bravery is all about.
Yeah. And I really, really love that idea too, because I even seen it come to play with a meeting I had with one of my own employees. We had a group meeting, and I was telling them about this idea that I wanted, and it was like a half-baked idea. So I was like, I wasn't even finished baking it. I was just telling them what I had came up with so far and what I kind of wanted to implement. And it's something that I had literally been thinking about for like 3 weeks straight. After literally 3 seconds of me explaining what I wanted to do, one of the other employees actually took that idea and made it 10 times better than I even could have imagined myself. And also 10 times more efficient, more profitable, more everything. And then it's like, wow, I spent 3 weeks on that. And maybe I should have kind of told everybody about this maybe 3 weeks ago, and we could have been 3 weeks further than where we are today. So it really does come into play. And it's amazing how sometimes as a leader, you have to get out of your own way in order for the best ideas to really come to the surface and be in that position of being vulnerable enough to say it, that I don't have it all together yet.
That's right. So the question is, Joe, when your employee improved on your idea, the moment of truth is, what was your response to that? If you were excited about that and you recognized him or her and you gave that person credit and you accommodated that input and that feedback and you were excited about it, you're sending very clear signals to your team that that's what you want, and that's what that's what you're going to be excited about. That's what you're going to reinforce.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if you get defensive? What happens if you emotionally don't respond well to, was he vulnerable when he contributed his idea back to you? Sure.
Yeah.
So the moment of truth is, how are you going to respond to that? That's a culture building moment. And everybody's going to be looking to, and they're going to be watching, and they're going to say, how's Joe going to respond to this? And if he can accommodate that, if he's excited about that, they're going to look around and they're going to say,
we come up with ideas, man.
I've got some ideas.
Yeah.
Right? And those ideas are welcome.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great example.
Yeah. And I would always think, like, with, a lot of companies having like literally millions of dollars. I don't have millions of dollars at my disposal. Maybe one day, but not yet. But with a lot of companies having millions of dollars at their disposal, you would think that, with, all the research and, development that they do, they wouldn't, it will make sense to me, as a consumer or as, even a small time entrepreneur, that they would kind of know these things. And I would think that, that would make sense. And I've been seeing, like, a lot of companies just go out of business lately, like, the Sears, the Blockbusters, the Toys R Us.
Yeah.
And it's been something that's so interesting to me, to, these giants, of companies that have fallen. And I wonder if that, one, culture has something to do about it. And two, how aren't these companies able to really pick up on those things that seem to be, because what you're saying seems to be pretty simple for me.
Mm-hmm.
But where do people struggle with that?
It's a great question. It's not as if they don't see what's going on. Their competitors are making moves in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
So the competition, all of their moves, all of their strategic bets, they're hidden in plain sight. Everybody can see everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they don't see what's going on, it's their capacity to respond. So then you have to ask yourself, so why are they not responding if they see what's going on? Well, that's arrogance creates in an organization. Success creates arrogance. Arrogance creates willful blindness. So I want you to think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Right? So that willful blindness means that we convince ourselves that we're still the best. We convince ourselves that we don't need to respond. We convince ourselves that somehow we will prevail. I mean, think about it. Kodak invents digital photography, but they don't embrace it and commercialize it. How's that possible?
I didn't even ever think about that.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Incredible. So it's amazing how this happens. It really is.
Yeah.
How do we get to a place of willful blindness? Success, and then arrogance, and then willful blindness, and then failure. And so as entrepreneurs, that's why the collaboration is vital and the humility is vital in leadership, because we don't want to fall into that trap.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes back to the example that you gave, Joe, about working with your employees in that collaborative spirit. That's what people want anyway. They want to have that kind of experience. So if your ego can't take that, if you're insecure, you're very much at risk of having a failure, because you think you're going to do it all by yourself. It's not going to happen. That's just not the way it works. Because even if you're successful once, how are you going to keep that going? You have to continually respond to the marketplace. So you're building adaptive capacity.
Yeah.
Adaptive capacity goes back to your culture. Adaptive capacity is based on your culture. It's based on the modeling behavior of leaders.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
So how has like company culture changed from like just with companies in general changed over the years? Because it seems like with millennials and then the younger generations, we care so much about company culture and, you know, the collaborative spirits, but it didn't always seem like people cared about that as much as they do now. So have you seen like a change over the years?
It really has changed, but Jasmine, you probably be a better authority than I would because you're a millennial and I'm not, right? But it's so fascinating how this has happened, because the old industrial model of an organization was that you had the thinking part of the organization at the top,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of the organization was the non-thinking part. It was the doing part.
Yeah.
So thinking part at the top, doing part, everybody else is the doing part. But you don't think. We don't even want you to think. Well, why has that changed? It's changed because it had to change. As markets became more competitive, you wouldn't be able to survive with that model, with just a few people at the top doing the thinking. That's never going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So the hyper competitive environment of the 21st century has forced organizations to change their cultures. And this is going on as we speak, where every member of the organization has a responsibility to contribute to innovation. So your job is not just to execute, it's also to innovate. So think about it this way. It's a very simple model. Organizations only do two things. They execute, which is to deliver value today, and they innovate, which is to figure out how will we deliver value tomorrow. That's really all we do, is execute and innovate. But so many people have it in their heads that my job is to execute, but I don't do innovation. Those are the guys in R&D, or those are the people at the top of the organization. That's absolutely not going to work in the 21st century.
Right.
Every employee has a responsibility to do both.
Absolutely.
So the old industrial model, back to your question, Jasmine, the old industrial model is a prison. It's a prison of paradigm. And so a lot of employees, we've even done surveys where you ask large populations of employees, is innovation part of your job? And 60 to 80% of them will say, no, it's not.
Wow.
How can that be?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But that's the way they think, right? They think innovation is not part of my job. I just execute.
Yeah.
But do you see that? That's how they think.
Yeah.
They're constrained by the mindset that they have and the way they've been socialized in the organization. That will never do as we go forward in the 2020s. It's never going to work.
Yeah.
So back to your point, Jasmine, millennials, they're coming in with a very different mindset. They care a lot more about lifestyle. They care a lot more about personal development. They care a lot more about career growth.
Yeah.
They care a lot more about making a meaningful contribution and finding meaning and purpose in their work. And so, again, that connects back to culture. So they want a healthy culture. And if they go in and they find a toxic culture, they just want to say adios. I just don't have time for that. So I want to go to a place where I can really make a difference.
Yeah.
So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
And going back to that idea of people not thinking innovation is part of their job, I do remember jobs I used to have where I liked the job, but there were these like small inefficiencies that they were small, but they were frequent to the point where it seemed like they were just very, very unproductive. And sometimes I would ask, like, why do we do it this way again when this is like kind of the more complicated way?
Yeah.
And a lot of times when you ask those questions, if the like in a big enough company, old enough company, kind of set in their ways, kind of like you said, they've already become successful now, a little bit arrogant. Now they have that willingful blindness. When you ask that question to like your manager or a person that's 1, 2, 3 levels above you, sometimes they don't even have an answer to why they do some of the things that the way they do. It's kind of just one of those things that are tradition. And it's like, you can almost see it in some jobs where it's like your entry level employee can have an idea and just wonder, why don't we do it this way? And nobody will be able to answer you. And it's like this company has become so big and massive that it just takes too long to respond, or sometimes it just doesn't necessarily respond to innovative thought at all. So I can see where that comes from, because I worked for, 2 organizations at least where like it was definitely something where it was like they would just do things and it was fairly inefficient, and it was easily noticeable by everybody. But maybe me and maybe a couple other people were the only people who wondered, and sure. I was the only guy who was thought to ask one time. So I think a lot of our listeners should definitely, as you're growing your teams, definitely listen out for those ideas, because you never know, those ideas can make a big impact, especially if it's something where you're doing, hundreds or even thousands of transactions, every single week or every single month.
Right. Yeah. And that's completely normal, right, Joe? Everything that we do in an organization, when we put it in place as a process or a system or a structure or a technology or a procedure or a policy, we put it in place. And after a while, it becomes the way we do things, and it becomes part of the status quo.
Yeah.
And it becomes the word that we use in research is it becomes fossilized. So think about that. So it gets hard.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's very normal. The question is the culture healthy enough to keep looking at that and adapting? That's where we get into trouble, because when things get fossilized, a lot of times the culture just defends it, even though it needs to be changed.
Yes.
And so that's why we have to be agile in our thinking. We have to be open. We have to be collaborative with our colleagues. That's where culture again comes into play and becomes so important.
Absolutely. And this really goes back to the idea that you were talking about earlier, which is the psychological safety. Can you expand on what that really is and what that means and what it should mean to anyone who's like either the CEO or just an entry level employee? Because I feel like that's very important on both ends. So it kind of shed a little bit of light on what that psychological safety actually is and what it means.
Sure. Psychological safety means that you can interact in a social setting without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. But what we've found is that psychological safety follows a pattern, and there's a progression through 4 stages. So the first stage is what we call inclusion safety. Inclusion safety simply means that I feel that I fit in, that I feel part of the team, that I've been accepted, that I belong. That's stage 1. So think about all of the resources that we commit to trying to create inclusive environments. This is just the foundation. Stage 1 is inclusion safety, that I feel part of the team, I've been accepted. And a lot of organizations struggle with that, right? Mm-hmm. They just struggle with that. But that's the foundation, that's the bare minimum, that you can be accepted in the organization and that you don't have fear of being marginalized that way. So that's the first thing that people are looking for when they step into an organization. It's the first thing, a basic human need. They long to belong, they want to be accepted.
Yeah.
They want to fit in. So that's where we begin. That's stage one. Stage two is learner safety. Learner safety means I feel safe in the learning process, asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, even making mistakes. Now you'll notice inclusion safety is here. Learner safety means that my level of vulnerability is a little bit higher because I have to take risks in the learning process, right? Mm-hmm. So if the environment supports me in doing that, then I'm going to do it more and I'm going to gain confidence in doing that. So I'll give you an example from the research, and I put this in the book. And it applies outside of business too. So every 26 seconds, a young person in America drops out of high school.
Oh, wow.
Every 26 seconds.
Wow.
So you have to ask yourself the question, why is that happening? Assuming they don't have a legitimate learning disability, why is that happening? Yeah. It's because the learning process is a delicate process. It's intellectual and it's also emotional. The head and the heart come together when we learn. Yeah. So if a person doesn't feel supported and nurtured in that process, they lose confidence. It's the same in the workplace. It's the same for entrepreneurs. So the leaders, your listeners who have these companies that you're building, you have got to create learner safety so that people feel safe in that learning process. That's stage two. Stage three is contributor safety. So now we go up a little bit more. Now let me go back and just explain that psychological safety comes from a combination of two things. Number one, respect, the level of respect that you feel. Number two, permission, the level of permission to participate that you feel. It's the combination of respect and permission, those two things coming together. So at stage three, contributor safety, that means I feel safe as a member of the team to contribute, to use my skills and abilities to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be allowed to do that. I'm going to be given the encouragement and the autonomy and the guidance to do that. When people learn things, what's their the next natural desire is I want to use what I learned.
Yeah.
So that's why we go from learner safety to contributor safety. You don't want to just learn and then just sit there. You want to use it.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
So that's the third stage. The fourth stage is the highest stage. It's the culminating stage. We call it challenger safety. Challenger safety means that you feel a very high level of psychological safety, high enough that you are willing and able to challenge the status quo. Now, challenger safety is the highest level because if you're challenging the status quo, you're taking the biggest risk.
Yeah.
Your level of vulnerability now is at the highest level, right? Because it's one thing to feel included. Okay, that's foundation.
Yeah.
Go a little higher to learn. Go a little higher to contribute. But to challenge?
Yeah, that's where the sticks and stones come in.
That's a different animal.
Yeah.
Right? Now we're talking about the biggest personal risk. So this is where the leader makes all the difference from a cultural standpoint. If that leader can cultivate an environment where people will demonstrate intellectual bravery and they'll go for it and they'll challenge the status quo, watch out. You're going to be able to innovate. So that's the highest level.
For sure.
So while we've been on this podcast call, I've been thinking about the saying there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians. So there is the psychological safety, you want people to challenge the status quo because it does influence innovation. But what happens when it's like too many people challenging like at the same time and nothing's really getting done?
Okay. Fantastic question. So this is where the leader has to understand a constructive discussion and keep it constructive instead of a chaotic discussion. You have to discern the difference and make sure that we stay on a constructive path. If we get derailed, then we could be wasting our time.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the leader's job, to understand the difference. Now, sometimes it does appear a little bit chaotic as we're trying to figure things out, and it's not easy to do. But you've got to be able to discern the difference between that constructive and that derailing conversation that really is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's not always easy, but that's the role that the leader plays.
Yeah. And I think it's a thing where you, as a leader, you should ask yourself people's intention behind the discussions that's really taking place. I feel like if it's for the vision and the mission of the company, whatever that company does, I feel like it can be very, very constructive. But if it's for ulterior motives, personal gains, and different things of that nature, that's where I feel like it could really be either derailing or very destructive on, the company's behalf. So,
well, I think you make a good point, Joe. And so therefore the leader has to try to sense and discern the intent, right? If you can tell the person is really just trying to blow things up, trying to be subversive, trying to be difficult, those are not pure motives.
Yeah.
Right? The intent is off. But if the person is really trying to contribute, you can smell that too, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. So really, what is, I would say, the number one takeaway that you will want somebody to really glean from this podcast episode? I mean, we've talked about so much from, processes and systems in a company and company culture and psychological safety in the 4 stages. What would you want somebody to really get? And if they can only remember one thing, what would you want that thing to be from this episode?
That's a tough question, but I'll try this. I would say, I go back to, I think I made the comment at the beginning, as a leader, you cannot be a neutral actor. And so I'll say it again. You will either lead the way or get in the way.
Yeah.
And perhaps your most important role, above vision and strategy, above everything else, will be to be the social architect of your organization. You are the curator of your culture. Every day, your modeling behavior is contributing to the creation of that culture in the organization. And so I would just say, be mindful of that and ask yourself some very honest questions about what kind of culture you're creating, what behavior you're modeling, where you're leading the way versus getting in the way, so that you can, because the 21st century, it demands, as I said, a culture of intellectual bravery. So are you doing that? So I would leave your listeners with that question. Are you creating that culture of intellectual bravery where people are encouraged and they're empowered when they come to work, and you are challenging them and you're allowing them to challenge you?
Yeah. I love that. Just because, like, I used to be a very passive person, and I always kind of shifted a little bit towards like leadership roles, but I still try to be passive and just try to be like neutral pretty much and just nice to everybody, so everybody was happy.
Yeah, but hang on a sec, Jasmine. Being nice is not neutral. Being nice means you're leading the way. So that's great. You probably are underestimating your influence. You probably have a lot more impact than you realize.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've seen it. Like we bought a coffee shop franchise, and we're working on getting our second location up and running, but we have our first one, and at that company we have 6 employees that work and really with us. And there have been some conversations that we've had to have with different people on the team, and it wasn't anything like on our team, at least, we haven't necessarily had to even think about, firing a person or anything like that. But there's some tough conversations that have had to be had for not only the sake of that person, but the company as well. And you have those conversations in the most tactful way. And it's funny because I'm usually used to her throwing me under the bus to have the hard conversations. So I was like, it was this one person that they had good reasons to why they were calling off, but they were doing it like really, really last minute. And we needed to really talk to them about that because it was kind of messing up the schedule for the rest of the other people that were working with them. And I was like, man, I'm gonna have this conversation. And then she, literally, I hear her in the other room and she's already having that conversation. I'm like, wow. And you're doing it in a much nicer way than I think other people would. And I think people take things from you that they wouldn't necessarily take as well from other people, because I don't know how I would have said what you said. I just don't know.
I don't know.
I probably would have just
I stuttered a little bit,
been super direct and and it was it was crazy. But I was impressed.
That's one of the hardest things for a leader to do across the board is to hold people accountable with emotional intelligence. And I think that's what Jasmine does. It's not easy, but if you can do that, you are a very good leader. That's
Absolutely.
true.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
So you are on the Abundant Culture podcast, and we have to ask every guest that comes on, how do you spread abundance, whether that be in your personal life or in your business life or whatever?
My response to that question would be very simple, and that is teach what you learn. Be willing to teach, be willing to share. On demand.
Yeah.
And just be willing to share and teach what you're learning. I think that is extremely valuable because this is a learning journey for all of us.
Yeah.
So if you have that attitude, you're validating people as you're doing it, and you're helping you're helping them grow and develop. So I think that's a gift worth giving, and it doesn't cost you much.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's true.
Very inexpensive.
Yes.
For sure. So for somebody who they want to reach out to you because maybe they want to do a podcast episode with you because you are very good at podcast questions. I enjoyed this whole conversation, the answers that you gave and the feedback. Or maybe, they have a company and they know that they need guidance within their company. Maybe they're a CEO and they feel that something's off about their company's culture or even the processes within their company. So how would somebody who wants to get into contact with you for one of those reasons or multiple of those reasons, how would they actually find you?
They can simply visit our website at LeaderFactor.com. So that's the easiest way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome.
We would welcome them.
Absolutely. Awesome.
And everyone, do not forget that this whole subject matter is in a book. So make sure you guys get the book because
Absolutely.
this was a great conversation. So I could only imagine what the book looks like.
Yeah. And I'm also very excited for, our podcast listeners that they're not just entrepreneurs, but they also have a W-2 job. They work for some other company. I'm excited for what this book could do if it gets in the hands of some employee that is able to speak up and get, to the ears of the people that are in leadership in their company and able to share with them this same knowledge that you've shared with us on this podcast and really start to affect the company from the ground up. So I feel like this subject matter isn't just for, leaderships, but it's for the future leaders and it's for people who have the ears of leadership. So I really am excited to, honestly read the book ourselves and honestly really give people that same opportunity to read that manuscript.
Well, thanks very much. And it's been a real pleasure to be on the podcast with you.
Thank you
so
again.
much. Yeah.
So that's all we have for today, folks. I hope you got as much value out of this as we did. Keep in mind, the only way we can improve is through constructive feedback. So remember to rate and review this episode. Also, you are not the only person that needs to know this super valuable information. So be sure to subscribe and share as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember to always spread abundance. Peace.